The first time Beatrice Underwood pointed a shotgun at a man, she had been 17 years old and defending her father's smokehouse from a thief. The second time, she was 26, standing on the porch of a boarding house in Cheyenne, Wyoming Territory in the autumn of 1878, and the man on the other end of her aim was the largest, most infuriatingly calm human being she had ever encountered. "I said this is private property," she called out, her voice steady despite the way her hands trembled around the stock of the gun. "You will turn that horse around and ride back the way you came." The man did not turn his horse around. He sat there in the fading orange light, his hat pushed back on his head, studying her the way a man might study a spooked mare, careful and unhurried. "Ma'am, I believe you have the wrong property. This here is the old Callahan spread, and I bought it fair and square from the bank 3 days past. Got the papers in my saddlebag if you care to see them." Beatrice felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had come all the way from Missouri believing this land was hers, willed to her by an uncle she had barely known, only to arrive and find strangers already claiming it. She had been staying at a boarding house in town while she sorted out the confusion with the land office, and this morning she had ridden out here alone, determined to see the property with her own eyes before any lawyer told her otherwise. "That cannot be right," she said, though her voice wavered. "My uncle, Thomas Underwood, left this land to me in his will. I have the letter from his attorney right here." The man swung down from his horse with an ease that suggested he had done it 10,000 times, and Beatrice tightened her grip on the shotgun, though something in his manner made her doubt he meant her harm. He was tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of men who worked cattle and fences and did not sit behind desks, and his face was weathered by sun and wind, though he could not have been much past 30. His eyes, when they met hers, held no menace at all, only a kind of tired amusement. "Ma'am, I am sorry for your trouble, truly I am, but I bought this land from the Cheyenne Land Office not 4 days ago. There must be some mistake in the paperwork, perhaps 2 deeds filed on the same parcel, though I have never heard of such a thing happening before. My name is Henry Hartwell. I run cattle, or I intend to, once I get this place in order." "Beatrice Underwood," she said, though she did not lower the shotgun, "and I intend to get to the bottom of this before I trust a word you say, Mr. Hartwell. I have learned that men who speak so smoothly and reasonably are often the ones with the most to hide." Something flickered across his face then, not quite offense, more like surprise, as though no one had ever accused him of being smooth before in his entire life. He almost laughed, but caught himself, perhaps sensing that laughter would not serve him well in that particular moment. "I do not believe anyone has ever called me easy to deal with, Miss Underwood. Ornery, stubborn, hard-headed, my own mother called me a mule more than once, but easy is a word I have never once heard applied to my character." "I did not call you easy in that sense," Beatrice said, feeling a flush rise in her cheeks despite herself. "I meant I do not trust men who present themselves as reasonable and kind on first meeting. In my experience, such men often have the crookedest intentions underneath." "Well, that is a fine way to greet a neighbor," Henry said, and there was no real anger in it, more a kind of weary patience, as though he had encountered suspicion before and had learned to wait it out rather than fight it. "I suppose you have your reasons for feeling that way, though I cannot imagine what I have done in the last 5 minutes to earn such distrust, beyond buying a piece of land that apparently was not entirely mine to buy." Beatrice lowered the shotgun then, though only partway, still holding it across her body in a way that suggested she could raise it again should the need arise. The truth was that something in his voice, low and even and unhurried, had begun to loosen the knot of fear in her chest, though she was not yet ready to admit that to herself, let alone to him. "I will ride into town tomorrow and speak with the land office clerk," she said. "If you have papers, as you say, then perhaps mine are the ones in error, or perhaps my uncle's estate was settled improperly before I arrived to claim it. Either way, I do not intend to stand here arguing with a stranger over land neither of us may end up keeping." "That sounds like a reasonable plan, Miss Underwood," Henry said, and he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was almost courtly, out of place on a man who smelled of trail dust and horse sweat. "In the meantime, might I offer you a cup of coffee? The Callahans left behind a stove that still works, and I have not had company in longer than I care to admit." "I think not," Beatrice said quickly, though her stomach growled in betrayal of her words, reminding her that she had eaten nothing since a hard biscuit at dawn. "I will find my own way back to town, thank you." She turned to walk toward her horse, tethered near the fence line, but her boot caught on a root hidden beneath the tall grass, and she stumbled hard enough that the shotgun clattered from her hands. Henry was beside her before she even registered movement, his hand closing around her arm to steady her, and for a moment they stood close enough that she could see the flecks of gold in his brown eyes, could smell leather and wood smoke on his shirt. "Easy now," he said softly, and then seemed to catch the irony of his own words because the corner of his mouth twitched upward. "I mean, careful, Miss Underwood. Ground out here is treacherous if you do not know it." She pulled her arm free, embarrassed by how flustered she felt, and bent to retrieve the shotgun herself before he could offer to do it for her. "I am perfectly capable of walking across a field, Mr. Hartwell." "I never doubted it," he said, though the amusement had not fully left his voice. "Will you at least allow me to ride alongside you back to town? The light is going, and there have been reports of a man causing trouble on the roads west of here, robbing travelers of their horses and whatever coin they carry." Beatrice hesitated. Every instinct she had cultivated over the past 2 years, since the man in Missouri had taught her exactly how dangerous charm could be, told her to refuse, to insist on her independence, to prove that she needed no man's protection. But the sun was indeed sinking fast, and she had heard those same rumors of a bandit called Silas Reed operating in the territory, a man who had already relieved 3 travelers of their belongings in the past month alone. "You may ride behind me at a distance," she said finally. "I will not object to that much." Henry nodded, as though this compromise satisfied him entirely, and together they made their way back toward Cheyenne beneath a sky bruising into purple and gold. Neither spoke much during the ride, though Beatrice found herself stealing glances at the man behind her, trying to reconcile his easy manner with the wariness that had become her constant companion since leaving Missouri. By the time they reached the edge of town, the stars had begun to emerge, and Beatrice felt a strange reluctance to part ways, though she would not have admitted it under torture. Henry helped her down from her horse outside the boarding house, his hands brief and respectful at her waist, and then stepped back with a small bow of his head. "I hope you find satisfaction at the land office tomorrow, Miss Underwood, and for what it is worth, I meant no disrespect by offering you coffee. Out here, a person learns that kindness costs nothing and sometimes means everything." "We shall see about that, Mr. Hartwell," Beatrice said, though her voice had lost some of its earlier edge. "Good evening." She watched him ride away into the darkness before she allowed herself to release the breath she had not realized she was holding. The land office the next morning was crowded with cattlemen and homesteaders arguing over water rights, and Beatrice waited nearly 2 hours before a harried clerk named Otis Pemberton could attend to her claim. When she finally laid her uncle's will and the accompanying letter from his attorney upon the counter, Pemberton studied the documents with a frown that deepened by the minute. "This is peculiar, Miss Underwood," he said, adjusting his spectacles. "Your uncle's estate was indeed processed through this office, but there was a clerical delay of nearly 6 months due to a fire that destroyed several records last winter. In the confusion, it appears the parcel was mistakenly listed as available and sold to a Mr. Henry Hartwell before your claim could be properly recorded. So the land is rightfully mine," Beatrice said, relief flooding through her. "Legally speaking, it is complicated," Pemberton admitted, wringing his hands. "Mr. Hartwell paid good money for that land in good faith, believing it unclaimed." The territorial court would need to sort out whose claim supersedes the other, and such proceedings can take months, sometimes longer, particularly with the circuit judge only passing through Cheyenne twice a year. Beatrice's heart sank. Months of waiting with no income and dwindling savings, while lawyers argued over paper and ink. Is there no faster solution? There is one possibility, Pemberton said carefully. The two of you could reach a private arrangement, an agreement outside the court, dividing the land or working it jointly until such time as the legal matter is settled. I have seen it done before between reasonable parties. Beatrice left the land office with a heavy heart, uncertain whether reasonable parties described herself and Henry Hartwell at all, given how their first meeting had gone. Yet by the time she returned to the boarding house, practicality had begun to war with pride, and she found herself drafting a note to be delivered to the Callahan spread, requesting a meeting to discuss terms. Henry arrived at the boarding house 2 days later, freshly shaved and wearing a clean shirt, which Beatrice noted with some private amusement despite her determination to remain businesslike. They sat in the small parlor that Mrs. Dunmore, the boarding house proprietress, kept for exactly such meetings, a pot of tea between them that neither touched. I have given this considerable thought, Henry began, and I believe I have a solution that might serve us both if you are willing to hear it out. I am listening, Beatrice said, folding her hands in her lap. The Callahan spread is large, nearly 4,000 acres, more than enough for a substantial cattle operation and still leave room for a smaller homestead. I propose that you take the eastern portion, along the creek, which would suit a homestead and perhaps some crops, while I retain the western range for cattle. We could share the well near the old barn, since digging a second would cost more than either of us can easily spare, and we could split any legal fees required to formalize the arrangement before the circuit judge. Beatrice studied him carefully, searching for the trick, the hidden clause that would leave her disadvantaged, but she found none. That seems remarkably fair, Mr. Hartwell, almost too fair. I told you already, I have never been called easy, but I have been called fair by those who know me longest. My father taught me that a man's word is the only currency worth having out here, and I do not intend to cheat a woman out of land her own uncle wished her to have, whatever confusion the bank and the fire caused. And if I refuse your offer, if I insist on pursuing the matter through the courts instead, then I suppose we wait for the circuit judge together, neither of us farming nor ranching in the meantime, watching good grazing land sit idle while lawyers grow fat on our troubles. I would rather build something now than argue over ashes later, Miss Underwood. Beatrice found she had no argument against such plain sense, however much her pride wished to find one. Very well, Mr. Hartwell. I accept your terms provisionally, pending the paperwork being drawn up properly and witnessed. Agreed, Henry said, extending his hand across the tea tray. Beatrice hesitated only a moment before shaking it, and the warmth and strength of his grip lingered in her memory long after he had ridden away. Over the following weeks, Beatrice threw herself into the work of establishing her portion of the homestead. She hired a local carpenter, a soft-spoken man named Elijah Frost, to help her raise a small but sturdy cabin near the creek, and she spent her days clearing brush, planting a modest garden, and learning the particular challenges of Wyoming soil and weather from anyone willing to share their knowledge. Henry, for his part, kept largely to his own portion of the land, though their paths crossed often enough at the shared well, and gradually those crossings became something Beatrice found herself anticipating rather than dreading. It was in late October, when the first hard frost threatened the garden Beatrice had worked so hard to establish, that Henry proved the truth of his earlier words in a way she could not ignore. He arrived at her cabin before dawn, driving a wagon loaded with burlap sacks and old horse blankets, and without waiting for permission, began covering her rows of vegetables against the coming cold. You did not need to do this, Beatrice said, standing in her doorway in a shawl thrown hastily over her nightgown, watching him work with quiet efficiency. "I know I did not need to," Henry replied, not pausing in his labor. "I wanted to. I have watched you work yourself half to exhaustion on this garden, and it would be a shame to lose it to one cold night when a few old blankets might save it. Why do you care so much what happens to my garden, Mr. Hartwell?" He straightened then, wiping his hands on his trousers, and looked at her with an expression she could not quite read in the gray pre-dawn light. "I suppose I have grown fond of watching you prove every assumption I had about you wrong, Miss Underwood. When we met, I took you for a frightened woman in over her head. I have since learned you are neither frightened nor in over your head, merely careful, and I find I admire that more than I expected to." Beatrice felt her cheeks warm despite the cold morning air. "I am not accustomed to men admiring my caution. Most find it tiresome, or worse, an insult to their intentions." "Then most men are fools," Henry said simply, returning to his work, and Beatrice found she had no ready reply to that. The frost passed without claiming her garden, thanks to Henry's blankets, and something had shifted between them in the aftermath, a thawing that neither acknowledged aloud but that both seemed to feel. Beatrice began inviting him to supper on occasion, telling herself it was merely neighborly courtesy, a way of thanking him for his help, though she noticed she took more care with her cooking on those evenings than she cared to admit. It was during one such supper, in early November, that Beatrice finally spoke of the reasons behind her wariness, the history that had shaped her into a woman who kept a shotgun within reach and trusted smooth words less than rough honesty. "I was engaged once," she said, staring into her coffee cup rather than at Henry's face. "In Missouri 3 years past. His name was Randall Voss, and he was everything a young woman is taught to want in a husband: handsome, well-spoken, generous with compliments and small gifts. My father approved of the match. My mother wept with joy when he proposed." "What happened?" Henry asked gently when she paused too long. "I discovered, 2 weeks before our wedding, that he had already courted and abandoned 3 other young women in neighboring counties, each of them believing themselves his only intended bride, each of them having given him money or valuables he claimed to need for setting up our future household. He was not a poor man seeking to better himself through marriage, as I had believed. He was a swindler, plain and simple, working his charm across half the county before someone finally exposed him." "That is a hard thing to learn about a man you trusted," Henry said, his voice quiet. "The hardest part was not losing him, for I felt no true grief once the truth emerged. The hardest part was realizing how thoroughly I had been fooled, how his ease and charm had blinded me to every warning sign that others apparently saw clearly. I decided then that I would never again trust a man simply because he spoke smoothly or acted the gentleman. I resolved to trust only actions proven over time, never words offered freely." Henry was quiet for a long moment, turning his own coffee cup slowly between his hands. "I cannot blame you for that resolution, Miss Underwood, though I confess it makes for a difficult courtship, should a man wish to pursue one with you." The word hung in the air between them, courtship, spoken plainly where before there had only been careful avoidance of such implications. Beatrice looked up to find Henry watching her with an expression of such open honesty that her breath caught. "Is that what this is, Mr. Hartwell, a courtship? I do not rightly know what else to call it," he said. "I have shared my land with you, my labor, my supper table on more occasions than I can count now, and I find myself thinking of you at times when I ought to be thinking of cattle prices and fence repairs. If that is not the beginning of courtship, I confess I do not know what else the word might mean." Beatrice's heart pounded, torn between the pleasure his words brought and the old fear that pleasure itself might be a trap. "I told you when we met that I do not trust easy men, Henry. That has not changed, whatever else has shifted between us. And I told you I have never been called easy," Henry replied, leaning forward slightly. "I am asking you to test that claim, Beatrice, not with words but with time. Watch what I do, not what I say. If I fail to prove myself trustworthy through action, then you will have lost nothing but a neighbor's friendship. But if I prove true, Perhaps you might find room in that careful heart of yours for something more. It was the first time he had used her given name, and something in the intimacy of it, spoken so gently, undid a portion of the armor she had worn for 3 years. "I will consider it," she said softly, "though I make no promises, Henry Hartwell." "I would think less of you if you did," he replied, and the warmth in his smile stayed with her long after he had ridden home beneath the November stars. Winter descended upon the Wyoming Territory with its usual harsh indifference, burying the land under snow that made travel between the two properties difficult but not impossible. Henry proved his words through action exactly as he had promised, riding over through drifts to ensure Beatrice had sufficient firewood, teaching her how to properly bank her stove for overnight burning. And on one particularly brutal night in January, when a blizzard threatened to bury her cabin entirely, insisting she take shelter in the sturdier ranch house he had built on his portion of the land rather than risk the storm alone. "I will sleep in the barn," he assured her, seeing the wariness flicker across her face at the suggestion. "I only ask that you not freeze to death out of stubbornness, Beatrice. There is a spare room, proper and separate, and Mrs. Dunmore's own sister, Prudence, is staying with me currently to keep house while she visits from Laramie. Your reputation will remain entirely intact." The mention of a chaperone eased Beatrice's concerns considerably, and she found herself grateful for the warmth and company of the ranch house through 3 days of blizzard that would surely have proven dangerous, perhaps even deadly, had she remained alone in her smaller cabin. Prudence Dunmore turned out to be a sharp-witted widow of perhaps 50 years, who watched the interactions between Beatrice and Henry with obvious amusement and no small amount of approval. "That man has been half in love with you since the day he first mentioned your name to my sister," Prudence confided one evening, while Henry was out checking on the cattle despite the weather. "I have known Henry Hartwell's family for 20 years, back when his father still ranched in Nebraska before moving the operation west. Never seen the boy so distracted by anything as he has been by you these past months." "He has a strange way of showing distraction," Beatrice replied, though she could not keep a small smile from her lips. "He seems perfectly capable of managing his ranch, his cattle, and half my chores besides." "That is precisely how a Hartwell man shows he is besotted," Prudence said with a knowing look. "Actions, my dear, always actions with that family. His father was the same way with Henry's mother, God rest her soul, silent as the grave about his feelings, but you never saw a man work so hard to make a woman's life easier." The mention of Henry's mother caught Beatrice's attention. "Did something happen to her?" Prudence's expression softened with old sorrow. "Past 3 years back, from a fever that swept through their previous settlement. Henry was devastated, though he does not speak of it often. I believe part of why he moved out here to Wyoming, taking on new land and a fresh start, was to escape memories that had grown too heavy to carry in Nebraska." This revelation added new dimension to the man Beatrice had come to know, explaining perhaps the quiet steadiness beneath his easy manner, the way he seemed to understand loss and disappointment without needing them explained. When Henry returned from the storm that evening, snow dusting his shoulders and cheeks reddened from cold, Beatrice found herself studying him with new eyes, seeing not just the confident rancher, but the grieving son who had rebuilt his life through sheer determination and hard work. "You are looking at me strangely," Henry observed, hanging his coat by the door. "Have I grown a second head while I was out checking the herd?" "Prudence told me about your mother," Beatrice said gently. "I am sorry for your loss, Henry. That must have been terribly difficult." Something shifted in his face, a brief vulnerability quickly masked, though not quickly enough that Beatrice missed it entirely. It was a long time ago now. 3 years feels both like yesterday and like another lifetime, depending on the day. I do not speak of it often because there is little to be gained by dwelling on grief that cannot be undone. "That does not mean the grief is not still there," Beatrice said softly. "You do not have to pretend otherwise with me." Henry looked at her for a long moment, something unguarded passing across his features. "You are the first person in 3 years to say that to me without expecting me to either weep about it or pretend it never happened. Most people want tidy grief, Beatrice, something that fits neatly into conversation and then can be set aside. You seem willing to let it simply be what it is, messy and unresolved." "I suppose I understand something of unresolved feelings," Beatrice said, thinking of her own 3 years spent guarding her heart against any repeat of Randall Voss's betrayal. "Perhaps that is something we share, then. Along with this land, we are learning to divide fairly." The blizzard broke on the fourth day, leaving behind a world transformed into brilliant white beneath clear blue skies, and Beatrice returned to her own cabin with genuine reluctance, though she told herself this feeling stemmed merely from the comfort of Henry's better-stocked pantry and warmer hearth, rather than from the man himself. She knew this for the lie it was, but she was not yet ready to examine the implications too closely. Spring arrived slowly to the Wyoming Territory that year, mud season stretching interminably before the first green shoots finally pushed through soil still cold from winter's grip. Beatrice's garden, once again threatened by unpredictable late frosts, benefited from Henry's continued attention and expertise, and the shared well between their properties became almost a daily meeting point, ostensibly for water but increasingly for conversation that stretched longer with each passing week. It was in April, during one such meeting at the well, that trouble arrived in the form of a rider approaching from the eastern road, moving with the particular urgency that suggested either very good news or very bad. Beatrice recognized him after a moment as Otis Pemberton, the land office clerk, though he looked considerably more disheveled than his usual careful appearance suggested he preferred. "Miss Underwood, Mr. Hartwell," Pemberton called out, reining in his horse with obvious relief at having found them together. "I bring news, though I confess I am uncertain whether you will find it welcome or troubling." "Speak plainly, Mr. Pemberton," Henry said, moving instinctively closer to Beatrice's side. "We have grown accustomed to complications regarding this land. The circuit judge has finally scheduled his visit to Cheyenne, arriving within the fortnight to hear outstanding property disputes. Your case regarding the Callahan parcel is among those scheduled for review." Beatrice felt her stomach clench with sudden anxiety. In the months since their private arrangement, she had almost forgotten that their claim to the land remained legally unsettled, that a judge's decision could theoretically undo everything they had built together: the cabin, the garden, the careful division of labor and resources that had grown into something far more meaningful than mere business arrangement. "What are our chances, do you think?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Pemberton shifted uncomfortably in his saddle. "I could not say for certain, Miss Underwood. Circuit judges vary considerably in their interpretations of such matters. Some favor original claims regardless of subsequent sales, believing family inheritance should supersede commercial transactions. Others favor whoever paid money in good faith, regardless of prior claims, believing this protects the integrity of the land office's records. So it could go either way," Henry said grimly. "Either Beatrice retains her rightful inheritance and I lose my investment, or I retain my purchase and she loses land her own uncle intended for her." "There is a third possibility," Pemberton added hesitantly. "The judge could simply uphold whatever arrangement the two of you have already established between yourselves, provided you can demonstrate to his satisfaction that the division has been fair and mutually agreeable. Judge Harrison Whitfield, who will be presiding, is known to favor practical solutions over strict legal technicalities when such solutions can be shown to serve both justice and community stability." This offered some hope, and over the following 2 weeks, Beatrice and Henry worked diligently to document everything they had built together, the boundaries they had agreed upon, the shared resources, the improvements each had made to their respective portions of land. They gathered testimony from Mrs. Dunmore, from Prudence, from Elijah Frost the carpenter, from various neighbors who had witnessed their cooperative arrangement firsthand. Through it all, Beatrice found herself increasingly aware of how thoroughly her life had become intertwined with Henry's, how the prospect of losing either the land or her position beside him filled her with equal dread. The night before their scheduled hearing, Henry rode to Beatrice's cabin bearing a bottle of wine he had been saving. He claimed, for a special occasion, though he did not specify what occasion he had originally intended it for. "I wanted to speak with you before tomorrow," he said, settling into the chair across from her small table, "regardless of how the judge rules. There are things I should say now while I still have the chance, rather than wait for some perfect moment that may never arrive." Beatrice's heart quickened at his tone. "What things, Henry?" "I have followed your instructions faithfully these past months," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes. "I have shown you through action, rather than mere words, that I am not the kind of easy man you feared when we first met. I have worked beside you, protected your interests alongside my own, respected your independence even when every instinct told me to simply solve your problems for you rather than let you solve them yourself." "You have done all that and more," Beatrice acknowledged softly. "I could not have survived this past winter, this whole difficult year, without your help, Henry." "I do not want you to survive merely with my help," Henry said, leaning forward. "I want to build something permanent with you, Beatrice, not this careful division of land and labor we have maintained like business partners, but a true partnership, a marriage, if you would have me. I love you, Beatrice Underwood. I believe I have loved you since that first evening when you pointed a shotgun at me and then apologized for nothing at all, standing your ground exactly as you should have." Beatrice felt tears gathering that she had not expected, the culmination of months of careful hope finally breaking free of the restraints she had placed upon it. "Henry, I have spent 3 years building walls around my heart specifically to prevent exactly this moment, this vulnerability, this risk of trusting a man's words about love." "Then do not trust my words," Henry said gently. "Trust what you have witnessed with your own eyes these past 7 months. Trust the frost blankets and the shared firewood and the storm shelter and every small kindness offered without expectation of return. I am not asking you to believe me because I speak prettily, Beatrice. I am asking you to believe what you already know to be true, because you have watched it proven day after day." Beatrice rose from her chair and crossed the small distance between them, and Henry stood to meet her, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other in the lamplight, 7 months of careful courtship culminating in a silence more eloquent than any words could have offered. "I love you too, Henry Hartwell," she finally whispered. "God help me, I did not intend to. I fought against it with everything in me, but I love you nonetheless." Their first kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, as though both feared this happiness might prove as fragile as everything else uncertain in their lives, the land, the coming judgment, the future itself. But as the kiss deepened, hesitation gave way to something more certain, more sure, and when they finally parted, both were smiling with an openness neither had allowed themselves in years. "Whatever the judge decides tomorrow," Henry said, resting his forehead against hers, "I want you to know that my proposal stands regardless. Land can be divided, sold, lost to circumstance, but I do not intend to lose you to any judge's ruling, Beatrice. Marry me, and we will face whatever comes together, on whatever land we are left with." "Yes," Beatrice said, without hesitation this time. "Yes, Henry, I will marry you." The following morning brought them both to the small courthouse in Cheyenne, standing before Judge Harrison Whitfield, a stern-looking man of perhaps 60 years whose reputation for fairness apparently extended to a careful, methodical review of the extensive documentation they had prepared. He listened to testimony from Pemberton, from Prudence and Mrs. Dunmore, from Elijah Frost, each witness confirming the peaceful, productive arrangement Beatrice and Henry had maintained throughout the disputed period. "It is clear to this court," Judge Whitfield finally announced, after nearly 2 hours of deliberation, that both parties have acted in good faith throughout this unfortunate confusion of records. Miss Underwood's claim through inheritance is legitimate, as is Mr. Hartwell's claim through legal purchase, and rather than favor one legitimate claim over another, this court finds the arrangement already established between the parties to be both equitable and sensible. He paused, looking over his spectacles at Beatrice and Henry, who stood close together, hands clasped tightly. This court hereby formalizes the division of the Callahan parcel as already established by the parties themselves, granting clear title to the eastern portion, including the creek and homestead improvements, to Miss Beatrice Underwood, and clear title to the western range, including all grazing land and existing structures, to Mr. Henry Hartwell. The shared well shall remain a joint easement, as previously agreed, for the mutual benefit of both properties in perpetuity. Relief flooded through Beatrice so powerfully that she nearly wept right there in the courtroom, and Henry's hand tightened around hers in shared celebration. But the judge was not quite finished. "I understand," Whitfield continued, a hint of dry amusement entering his stern voice, "that congratulations may also be in order, given rumors that have reached even this court regarding an impending marriage between the two parties. Should such a marriage occur, I would note that it would render this entire question of divided property rather moot, as the two parcels would then belong, in essence, to a single household." Laughter rippled through the small courtroom, and Beatrice felt her cheeks flush with pleased embarrassment. "The rumors are entirely accurate, Your Honor," Henry announced proudly. "Miss Underwood has agreed to become Mrs. Hartwell, pending a proper wedding, of course." "Then I offer my congratulations," Whitfield said, allowing himself a rare smile, "and my hope that your marriage proves more harmonious than the property dispute that apparently helped bring you together." The wedding took place 6 weeks later, on a bright June morning, in the small Methodist church that served Cheyenne's growing community. Beatrice wore a dress of pale blue muslin that Mrs. Dunmore had helped her sew, simple but elegant, while Henry stood at the altar in his best suit, looking simultaneously nervous and radiantly happy, an expression that Beatrice would treasure in memory for the rest of her days. Prudence Dunmore had returned specifically for the occasion, declaring she would not miss witnessing the culmination of a courtship she had predicted from the very beginning. The ceremony itself was brief but heartfelt, presided over by a young minister named Reverend Caldwell, who had only recently arrived in the territory himself, and seemed genuinely moved by the story of how the couple had met, a story that had, by this point, become something of local legend, embellished with each retelling until Beatrice's shotgun had grown to mythical proportions, and Henry's calm response had become the stuff of local folklore. "Do you, Henry Hartwell, take Beatrice Underwood to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do," Henry said, his voice steady and sure, his eyes never leaving Beatrice's face. "Do you, Beatrice Underwood, take Henry Hartwell to be your lawfully wedded husband?" "I do," Beatrice answered, and found that the words carried none of the fear she might once have expected, only a profound sense of rightness, of having finally found solid ground after years of careful, guarded footing. When Reverend Caldwell pronounced them husband and wife, and Henry lifted her veil to kiss her properly before their assembled friends and neighbors, Beatrice felt 3 years of careful walls finally crumble entirely, replaced by something far more valuable than the protection they had offered, a partnership built on demonstrated trust rather than mere promises, on actions proven true over time rather than words offered freely. Their combined property, now legally united through marriage exactly as Judge Whitfield had predicted, became one of the most productive ranches in that section of the Wyoming Territory over the following years. Henry's cattle operation expanded steadily, while Beatrice's garden grew into a small but thriving enterprise supplying vegetables to the growing town of Cheyenne, along with preserves and baked goods that earned her something of a reputation among the local community. Their first child, A son they named Thomas after Beatrice's uncle, whose unexpected inheritance had brought them together in the first place, arrived in the spring of 1880, nearly 2 years after their marriage. Henry proved every bit as devoted a father as he had been a suitor, spending long evenings walking the colicky infant across their bedroom floor so Beatrice could rest, and teaching young Thomas to ride almost before the boy could properly walk. 2 years after Thomas, a daughter followed, whom they named Sarah after Henry's late mother, a gesture that brought tears to Henry's eyes when Beatrice first suggested it. "She would have loved you fiercely," Henry told his wife, watching her nurse their newborn daughter by lamplight. "She always said she wanted grandchildren raised with both toughness and tenderness, exactly as you are raising ours." The ranch continued to prosper through the years, weathering the occasional hardships that came with frontier life, droughts that tested their resources, harsh winters that claimed livestock despite their best precautions, the ever-present tension with neighboring operations over water rights and grazing boundaries. But through it all, Beatrice and Henry faced each challenge as the true partners they had become, their early careful division of labor evolving into a seamless collaboration that neighbors often remarked upon with something approaching envy. Beatrice's transformation from the wary, shotgun-wielding woman who had first confronted Henry on disputed land into a confident ranch wife and mother did not happen overnight, nor did it happen without occasional relapses into old fears, particularly during the early years of their marriage, when trust still felt like a muscle she was learning to properly use after years of deliberate atrophy. There was one particular incident, in the autumn of 1881, that tested this trust more severely than any challenge since their initial courtship. Henry had traveled to Denver on ranch business, intending to negotiate the sale of a substantial portion of their cattle herd to buyers who could offer better prices than the local Cheyenne market provided. He had promised to return within 10 days, but as those 10 days stretched to 12, then 14, with no word arriving, old fears began resurfacing in Beatrice's mind despite 3 years of proven devotion. She confided her growing anxiety to Prudence Dunmore, who had settled permanently in Cheyenne by this point, having grown fond of the community, and particularly of watching Beatrice and Henry's family grow. "You do not truly believe he has abandoned you," Prudence said gently, though not unkindly, recognizing the old wound that Beatrice's fear stemmed from. "Not after everything he has proven these past years." "I know it is foolish," Beatrice admitted, bouncing young Sarah on her hip while Thomas played nearby with wooden blocks Henry had carved for him. "But foolish fears do not always yield easily to reason, Prudence. What if something has happened to him? What if he has met with foul play on the road? Or worse, what if he has simply decided this life, this family, was not what he wanted after all?" "Beatrice Hartwell," Prudence said sternly, using her married name deliberately, "you have spent 3 years watching that man prove his devotion through action after action, through storm and drought and every small daily kindness a marriage requires. Do not let old wounds convince you that proven love has suddenly become false." As it happened, Henry's delay stemmed from far more mundane circumstances than Beatrice's fears had conjured. A late-season blizzard had closed the mountain passes between Denver and Cheyenne earlier than anyone had anticipated, stranding him and several other travelers at a way station for nearly a week before conditions cleared sufficiently for safe passage. When he finally arrived home, exhausted and half-frozen but otherwise entirely well, he found Beatrice waiting on the porch, having apparently kept vigil there for the better part of 2 days despite the cold. "Beatrice, you should not be out here in this weather," he said, dismounting quickly and crossing to her with obvious concern. "You will catch your death waiting outside like this." "I was worried," she admitted, her voice breaking slightly as relief flooded through her at the sight of him whole and healthy. "You were so late, Henry, and I could not help but fear the worst." Henry gathered her into his arms, holding her close despite the cold still clinging to his coat from the journey. "I am sorry to have worried you, my love. The pass was closed by an early storm, and I had no way to send word ahead. I should have anticipated such delays and warned you before I left that winter travel in these mountains carries its own unpredictable timeline." "It is not your fault," Beatrice said, pulling back enough to look at his face, reassuring herself of his continued presence. "I know it is not your fault, Henry. It is simply that old fears do not disappear entirely, even when new evidence contradicts them at every turn." "Then let this be further evidence," Henry said gently, cupping her face in his cold hands. "I will always come back to you, Beatrice, whatever obstacles the world places in my path. Storms may delay me, circumstances may complicate my plans, but my devotion to you and to our children remains as constant as the North Star. You need never doubt that again." This incident, rather than reopening old wounds, ultimately helped heal them more thoroughly than years of steady devotion alone might have accomplished. For it demonstrated to Beatrice that even when circumstances aligned to trigger her deepest fears, Henry's actual character remained exactly as trustworthy as he had always proven himself to be. The old wariness that had defined her character for so long finally began to fade in earnest after that winter, replaced by a security she had once believed herself incapable of feeling toward any man. The years continued to unfold with the particular rhythm of ranch life in the Wyoming Territory, each season bringing its own challenges and rewards. In 1883, Beatrice gave birth to their third child, another son they named William, and by this point their combined ranch had grown substantial enough that Henry had taken on 2 additional hired hands to help manage the expanded cattle operation, along with a young woman named Charity Blackwood, who assisted Beatrice with household duties and the increasingly complex demands of raising 3 young children while still maintaining her beloved garden and preserve-making enterprise. It was also in 1883 that Wyoming Territory took the historic step of granting women the right to vote in territorial elections, a development that Beatrice followed with intense interest and no small measure of pride. She had, by this point in her life, become something of a respected voice within the local community. Her transformation from wary newcomer to established rancher's wife, accompanied by genuine involvement in matters affecting the growing town of Cheyenne and its surrounding settlements. "I never imagined, when I first arrived in this territory, pointing a shotgun at the man who would become my husband," she told a gathering of local women during a discussion about the upcoming territorial elections, "that I would one day have the opportunity to cast a ballot in shaping our community's future. This territory has given me far more than land and family, ladies. It has given me a voice I did not know I possessed." Henry, who had come to collect her from the meeting and stood listening from the doorway, felt an overwhelming surge of pride at his wife's words, recognizing in them the culmination of everything he had hoped to help her discover within herself when he had first insisted on proving his trustworthiness through action rather than mere words. Their fourth and final child, a daughter named Grace, arrived in 1886, completing their family in a manner that felt entirely appropriate given how their story had begun. Henry often joked, in later years, that Grace's arrival represented the grace that had ultimately governed their entire courtship and marriage, the unexpected mercy that had transformed a property dispute into a lifetime partnership. Neither had anticipated when they first met as wary strangers on disputed land. As their children grew, the ranch continued to prosper, becoming known throughout the region for both the quality of Henry's cattle and the exceptional preserves and produce that Beatrice's garden enterprise supplied to markets as far away as Laramie, and even, on occasion, to buyers who shipped her goods further east via the growing railroad networks that increasingly connected the territory to broader American commerce. Thomas, their eldest, showed early aptitude for ranch management, working alongside his father from a young age and demonstrating the same steady, patient temperament that had first drawn Beatrice to Henry so many years before. Sarah, meanwhile, inherited her mother's practical intelligence and her grandmother's namesake tenderness, showing particular skill with the garden, and as she grew older, with tending to sick or injured animals on the ranch, a skill that eventually led her toward informal veterinary work that served the broader ranching community. William, their second son, proved more adventurous in temperament, often testing the patience of both parents with his tendency toward mischief and exploration beyond the ranch boundaries, though this same spirit eventually served him well when, as a young man, he became instrumental in expanding the family's cattle operation into new territory, as Wyoming's ranching industry continued to grow throughout the 1890s. Grace, the youngest, grew into a young woman with her father's easy charm and her mother's underlying strength, a combination that made her particularly effective when she eventually took over management of the household's business affairs, including the continued success of the preserve enterprise her mother had established decades earlier. Through it all, through the raising of 4 children, through droughts and hard winters, and the occasional conflicts with neighboring ranches over water rights and grazing boundaries that seemed an inevitable feature of frontier life, Beatrice and Henry's partnership only deepened with time. The wariness that had once defined Beatrice's character had transformed, not into naive trust, but into a hard-won wisdom about the difference between empty charm and demonstrated character, a lesson she made certain to pass along to each of her children as they grew old enough to understand it. "Trust is not given freely," she told Sarah, when her daughter came to her at 17, confused about a young man's attentions and uncertain whether his kindness represented genuine character or mere performance. "Trust is earned through consistent action over time, through what a person does when they believe no one important is watching, through how they treat you when circumstances grow difficult rather than merely convenient. Watch this young man carefully, Sarah. Let him prove himself through deed rather than word, exactly as your father proved himself to me all those years ago." Sarah took this advice to heart, eventually marrying a young rancher named Jacob Pierce only after 2 full years of careful courtship that satisfied her that his character matched his pleasant words, a courtship that Beatrice and Henry watched with the particular satisfaction of parents who recognized their own hard-learned wisdom being properly applied by the next generation. As Beatrice and Henry entered their later years, their ranch having grown into one of the most successful and respected operations in that portion of Wyoming, they often found themselves reflecting on the improbable circumstances that had first brought them together. On the 20th anniversary of their marriage, in June of 1898, their now-grown children organized a celebration at the ranch that drew neighbors and friends from throughout the region, many of whom had heard some version of the famous story about the shotgun and the disputed land, though few knew the full details beyond the basic outline that had become local legend. "Tell us the real story," Grace insisted during the celebration, now a poised young woman of 12 years who had heard fragments of the tale but never the complete account from her parents' own perspective. "Everyone in town tells it differently. Some say mother nearly shot father dead on sight. Others say he charmed her instantly, and she fell into his arms within the hour." Henry laughed, settling into his chair on the porch that had witnessed so many important moments in their shared history, while Beatrice brought out coffee and the particular preserves that had become something of a signature offering at Hartwell gatherings over the years. "Neither version is entirely accurate," Henry said, "though I confess your mother's aim with that shotgun was steady enough that I had genuine concerns for my safety in those first few minutes." "I was frightened," Beatrice admitted, settling beside her husband with the ease of 20 years' comfortable companionship. "I had lost faith in men entirely by that point, thanks to a foolish engagement in Missouri that taught me harsh lessons about charm and deception. When your father appeared, so calm and reasonable despite my hostility, I assumed he was simply another smooth talker attempting to manipulate his way past my defenses. I told her I had never been called easy in my life, Henry added, and I meant it entirely. Stubborn, difficult, hard-headed, certainly, but never easy. It took months of proving that particular claim before your mother finally allowed herself to trust what she was witnessing, rather than remaining suspicious of hidden motives. What finally convinced you, Mother? Thomas asked, now a grown man of 18 who had taken on increasing responsibility for the ranch's daily operations alongside his father. What made you finally believe Father's intentions were genuine? Beatrice considered this question carefully, looking at her husband with the same steady affection that had grown between them across 2 decades of shared life. It was not any single moment, she finally said. It was the accumulation of small kindnesses offered without expectation of return, the frost blankets for my garden, the shelter during that terrible blizzard, the patient way he answered every suspicious question I posed without ever growing defensive or frustrated with my caution. Trust builds slowly, children, through consistent action rather than dramatic gestures. Your father taught me that lesson more thoroughly than any words could have accomplished. And what convinced you, Father, that Mother was worth pursuing despite her initial hostility? Sarah asked, now married herself and expecting her first child, understanding perhaps better than her younger siblings the particular courage required to trust again after being wounded by betrayal. Henry smiled, reaching for Beatrice's hand with the easy familiarity of long partnership. Her very hostility, strange as that may sound, I recognized in her caution not weakness but strength. A woman who had been hurt but had not allowed that hurt to break her spirit entirely, merely to make her more careful about where she invested her trust going forward. I found that strength admirable rather than off-putting, and I wanted, more than almost anything I had wanted before, to prove myself worthy of eventually earning that careful trust. As the celebration continued into the evening, with neighbors sharing stories and children playing games in the yard beneath a sky beginning to show the first stars of approaching night, Beatrice found herself overwhelmed with gratitude for the life she and Henry had built together. The wary young woman who had arrived in Wyoming Territory 2 decades earlier, shotgun in hand and heart guarded against any possibility of trust, could never have imagined the richness that awaited her. The 4 children now grown or growing into adulthood, the successful ranch that had provided not just for their own family, but had contributed meaningfully to the broader community's development, the marriage that had proven, day after day and year after year, that not all men who spoke reasonably and acted kindly harbored hidden deceptions beneath their pleasant exteriors. Later that evening, after their guests had departed, and their children had retired to their various rooms throughout the now substantial ranch house that had grown considerably from the simple structures they had first built decades earlier, Beatrice and Henry sat together on their porch, watching the last light fade from the Wyoming sky. 20 years, Beatrice said softly, leaning her head against Henry's shoulder in a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over their years together. I could not have imagined, that first evening when I pointed my shotgun at you, that we would arrive here, at this particular moment, with this particular life we have built together. I imagined it, Henry said, pressing a kiss to the top of her head. Perhaps not the specific details, but I knew from that very first meeting that you were a woman worth pursuing, worth proving myself to, however long that proof might require. I have never regretted a single day of that pursuit, Beatrice, nor a single day of what came after. Even the difficult days, the droughts and the hard winters, the worry over cattle prices and children's fevers. Especially those days, Henry said firmly. Because facing difficulty alongside you, building solutions together rather than struggling separately, that has been the greatest privilege of my life. I would choose this life again in an instant, every hardship included, simply for the chance to share it with you. Beatrice turned to look at her husband, This man who had proven himself trustworthy through 20 years of consistent action, who had transformed her understanding of what genuine love and partnership could look like, who had helped heal wounds she had once believed permanent. "I love you, Henry Hartwell," she said simply. "More now than even on our wedding day, if such a thing is possible." "I believe it is entirely possible," Henry replied, "for I find the same is true for me. Loving you has only grown easier and more natural with each passing year, Beatrice, even as I continue to insist, for the sake of that old joke between us, that I have never truly been an easy man." Beatrice laughed, the sound carrying across their porch into the gathering darkness, a sound of genuine, uncomplicated joy that would have seemed impossible to the wary young woman who had first arrived on this land 20 years earlier. "No," she agreed, smiling up at him with all the love that had grown between them across 2 decades of shared life. "You have never been an easy man, Henry Hartwell, but you have always, from that very first meeting, been an honest one. And I have come to understand that honesty, proven consistently through years of faithful action, is worth infinitely more than mere ease ever could be." They remained on that porch until the stars had fully emerged overhead, 2 people who had built something lasting and true from the unlikely beginning of a property dispute and a woman's justified wariness, their partnership standing as testament to the possibility that trust, once broken, could indeed be rebuilt, given sufficient patience, consistent honesty, and the willingness to prove one's character through action rather than mere words alone. Their story became something of a local legend throughout that portion of Wyoming, told and retold at community gatherings for years afterward, though the details often grew embellished with each telling, the shotgun growing more dramatic, Henry's calm response growing more heroic, until the tale bore only passing resemblance to the actual events that had transpired that autumn evening in 1878. But Beatrice and Henry themselves needed no embellishment to appreciate the true significance of their story, understanding better than any storyteller could convey the genuine courage required to trust again after betrayal, the patient dedication required to prove oneself worthy of that trust, and the profound joy that awaited those willing to risk vulnerability in pursuit of authentic love. Their ranch continued to prosper for decades afterward, eventually passing to Thomas and his own growing family as Henry and Beatrice aged into their later years, content to watch their children and grandchildren carry forward the legacy of hard work, consistent honesty, and genuine partnership that had defined their own marriage from its unlikely beginning. Sarah's veterinary work expanded to serve the broader ranching community throughout the region. William's adventurous spirit led him to establish a second successful ranch operation that further expanded the family's presence throughout the territory. And Grace's business acumen transformed her mother's simple preserve enterprise into an operation substantial enough to supply markets throughout the growing state of Wyoming, which achieved statehood in 1890. 12 years after Beatrice had first arrived as a wary young woman, defending disputed land with nothing but a shotgun and fierce determination. In their final years together, Beatrice and Henry often sat on that same porch where they had shared so many important conversations across the decades, watching their grandchildren play in the yard where their own children had once played, reflecting on a life that had exceeded every hope either had dared harbor during that difficult first meeting, when trust seemed like an impossible luxury neither could afford. Henry passed peacefully in 1912, at the age of 64, surrounded by Beatrice and their 4 children, along with numerous grandchildren who had grown to love and admire the steady, patient grandfather who had taught them all, through his own example, the value of proving character through consistent action rather than empty words. Beatrice survived him by 8 more years, continuing to manage her portion of the ranch's affairs with the same careful competence that had defined her entire adult life, watching her grandchildren grow into adulthood themselves, occasionally sharing with them, particularly during quiet evening conversations on that same beloved porch. The story of how she had once distrusted all men who spoke smoothly and acted kindly, until one particular rancher had proven, through 20 years of faithful action, that not every reasonable, kind man harbored hidden deception beneath his pleasant exterior. "Your grandfather," she told her eldest grandchild, Thomas's own son named Henry in honor of the grandfather he had barely known, "taught me that trust, once broken, can indeed be rebuilt, but only through patient, consistent proof of character over time. He never once asked me to simply believe his words. He showed me, through years of faithful action, exactly who he was, and allowed me the time and space to recognize that truth for myself, rather than demanding I accept it on faith alone. That, my dear, is the truest form of love I have ever witnessed. Love that respects a person's need for genuine proof, rather than expecting blind trust based on pleasant words alone." Young Henry, then just entering his own adulthood and beginning to consider questions of courtship and marriage himself, took his grandmother's words to heart, carrying forward into his own generation the hard-won wisdom that Beatrice Underwood Hartwell had first learned through painful betrayal, and then rebuilt through the patient, consistent devotion of a rancher who had never claimed to be easy, but who had proven himself, through decades of faithful action, to be entirely and completely trustworthy. Beatrice passed in 1920, at the age of 68, in the same ranch house she and Henry had built together decades earlier, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had gathered to bid her farewell. Her final words, spoken softly to Sarah, who sat beside her bed, referenced the story that had defined her entire adult life, the improbable beginning that had led to such profound and lasting happiness. "Tell them," she whispered, "tell all of them that I don't trust easy men, but I trusted your father completely, because he never once claimed to be easy. He simply proved himself day after day, year after year, to be exactly what he claimed, an honest man worthy of trust freely given. That is the only kind of love worth having, Sarah. Anything less is merely pleasant deception, however sweetly it might be spoken." She was buried beside Henry in the small cemetery outside Cheyenne, their shared headstone bearing both their names along with a simple inscription that Sarah had chosen specifically to honor the story of how her parents had first met and fallen in love. Trust, once earned through faithful action, becomes the foundation of love everlasting. Their descendants continued to prosper throughout Wyoming for generations afterward, the Hartwell name becoming synonymous throughout the region with both successful ranching and the particular kind of honest, patient character that Henry had first demonstrated to a wary young woman defending her inheritance with nothing but a shotgun and fierce determination. The ranch itself, expanded considerably over the decades through the efforts of successive generations, remained in family hands well into the following century, each generation raised on the story of how their great-grandparents, or great-great-grandparents, had first met under circumstances that could easily have driven them apart rather than together, had either lacked the particular courage required to risk vulnerability in pursuit of authentic connection. The story of Beatrice Underwood and Henry Hartwell, though it began with suspicion and a leveled shotgun on disputed land in the Wyoming Territory of 1878, ultimately became a testament to the possibility of healing after betrayal, of rebuilding trust through patient, consistent action, and of discovering that the most profound love often grows not from instant attraction or smooth words, but from the slow, steady accumulation of proven character over time. Their marriage, spanning 34 years until Henry's passing and continuing in Beatrice's memory for 8 years afterward, stood as living proof that even the most wounded hearts could learn to trust again, provided they encountered patience sufficient to prove that not every kind word masked hidden deception, that some men, however reluctant to be called easy, proved themselves entirely worthy of the deepest trust a heart could offer. And so their story, passed down through generations of Hartwell descendants throughout Wyoming and beyond, continued to remind each new generation that authentic love required not grand declarations or immediate trust, but rather the patient willingness to prove one's character through consistent action, allowing trust to grow naturally from that foundation of demonstrated integrity, exactly as it had grown between a wary young woman and a rancher who had never once claimed to be easy, but who had proven himself, across decades of faithful partnership, to be worthy of every ounce of trust his beloved Beatrice had eventually, carefully, and completely given him.